Good afternoon, friends. I am delighted to have this chance to talk to you about the history, the importance, the influence of the American intelligence system. It is ironic that most of the evolution of this system, as we know it, took place during my lifetime, which shows how slow the United States was to discover what is necessary for a great nation to do in the way of understanding the world when it becomes a powerful influence for international stability and peace, or if it fails to exercise its responsibilities, an influence toward chaos and international difficulties. The field of intelligence is very old. Some people say that intelligence is the oldest living profession. It goes back to the Bible. There are lots of references to it, but I'm not sure that that's correct. There is another school of thought that another profession is really the oldest living profession, and there are some people who suggest you can't tell them apart. So I only bring this up to give you my point of view, which is that unlike the other field claiming to be the oldest living profession, in intelligence, experience is valued more than youth and enthusiasm. And I want to talk to you about my own experience in the intelligence world, which is still, I think, too little appreciated for its role in the decision-making process, the political governance process in our country. The task of running this country requires that information be available for our presidents, our secretaries of state, our decision makers in the military field, to enable them to make sensible decisions, to do what is most beneficial to the security of the United States, most helpful to the central purposes of our government. There's no mystery about what those are. A couple hundred years ago, the people who wrote our Constitution explained that the reason we had a government was to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are still the objects of government. And as the world gets more and more complex and we move into a time of intense international conflict, as we have been in for about 50 years since the beginning of World War II, it is crucial that our decision makers have a solid base for deciding the policies and the actual behavior patterns of the United States government. Now that's what intelligence is all about. The intelligence machine is a system to guarantee accurate and objective knowledge that will enable our government to be run well. Now that doesn't sound very sensational, and I'm sure that isn't what comes to mind with most of you when the subject of intelligence is mentioned. I'd just like to ask a question I often ask. How many people in this room have neither seen a James Bond movie nor read a book about James Bond? Anybody? Oh, there's one good soul out there. Hadn't been corrupted by the fantasies of spy fiction. I think that James Bond business has done more damage to the intelligence profession than anything else. I hate to tell you that intelligence work is very humdrum. Does not involve driving around in a sports car chasing some girl that looks like Ursula Andress. There aren't enough of those kind of girls to go around, and the day-to-day work of intelligence is really very simple to understand. It's hard to do, but it is not nearly so glamorous and certainly not nearly so wicked as most people like to believe. Let me give you a few words about what the intelligence process is. It really involves simply piercing what they, in military times, they call the fog of war, figuring out what's really happening on international battlefields. But even more important, in the last 50 years, piercing the fog of the kind of short-of-war conflicts that are neither peace nor war. I suspect that World War II will be the last declared war. It has certain inconveniences for people, for nations to declare wars, but if anybody thinks that since the end of World War II, 1945, these last years have been peaceful, they haven't been paying attention. There are short-of-war conflicts which are damaging nations, have destroyed governments, which cause enormous suffering and death and millions of casualties, and yet we don't quite know how to get hold of those conflicts and analyze them so that our government can conduct itself in a way that will enable us to protect ourselves, protect our citizens, protect our important positions and assets and allies abroad, and promote the general welfare of the people of the United States. That's what intelligence is for. The way they do it, of course, is simply to collect information, to conduct research and analysis on the subject matters that are germane to our policy making, and to integrate knowledge in a very cool and objective way. Now, this has a kind of glamorous side to it, particularly in my lifetime in OSS and CIA, when we began to develop two fields of activity that have tended to obscure and divert attention from the hard research and analysis side of intelligence, which is its main purpose. The two fields are the interception of electronic signals, which leads to code and cipher breaking, and during World War II was absolutely indispensable to our survival because we happened to be very good in this field and managed to break both the Japanese and German codes at a time when our lack of preparedness in a military sense made it not unlikely that we would have got so far behind in the military conflict that we never would have caught up. But the code and cipher work is indispensable. It has to be secret, because if you tell anybody that you're breaking their codes, they're obviously going to change them and you'll lose the capability. The other side, which developed in my own career, mid-career in CIA, was the field of what the experts call imagery, but essentially photo reconnaissance. Now that goes back a long way too, since Civil War days of balloons, but the taking of photographs from U-2 aircraft, which CIA developed in the 50s, and then from satellites, which even today are going around and around the Earth, both ours and the Soviet Union's, taking pictures of military installations and anything else, industrial installations that you want to observe. This photographic imagery and infrared and other types of imagery is the bread and butter of intelligence work. And that is all sort of technological and almost antiseptic in its moral quality. Nobody objects to getting their picture taken, I guess. But it is not still the heart of the problem. It is just a way of collecting information. It's establishing a database. And it's very good that in these last 40 years, we have ceased finding it necessary to send human beings out as agents at risk to their lives to take pictures of how many railway cars pass a given marshalling point in a railway system. We can photograph it from the space, and you can study it over a period of time and get a pretty good count. But unfortunately, neither code breaking, which has become much more difficult in the modern era with computers and fancy equipment to disguise your communications, nor imagery tell you very clearly all the things you need to know. You cannot take a picture of what's going on inside of anybody's head. Maybe someday we'll figure out that technology, but at the moment, the only way you can find out is to talk to somebody, get into their memoranda files, or steal some artifact which reveals what they're working at. And this brings you to the field of espionage. Now, espionage is simply the use of a human being to try to get into an area of knowledge that is being withheld from you. It might not be such an important area if we were in a peaceful world where nations were not competitive and there were not serious conflicts between them. But in fact, in all of my lifetime, there has been a major field of conflict between a number of nations in ways that are almost irreconcilable, and which involves some of the nations in particular being extremely secretive and trying to prevent people from finding out what their activities are, what their political and economic and military strength is, and in particular what they're going to do to influence our position in the world at large. So espionage, that's the penetration of a country in a way to find out information about it that is being hidden from you, is an indispensable addition to the technological skills of code breaking and imagery. Those three together make up the main intelligence collection function. And that's what I'm talking about, and I think it's terribly important that the American citizens understand that our safety depends on knowing a lot about these foreign activities. Why is that true? Well, it's true because in all of the period since I grew up in the 1930s, I've just been back to celebrate the 350th anniversary of my college, Harvard University. Since it only happens every 350 years, I thought I ought to get back there. I'll likely make another one. And when I graduated in 1939, it was a period in which the United States was remarkably dedicated to isolation, lack of interest in foreign affairs, a feeling that all of the troubles and military aggressions which were taking place in the 30s were none of our business. We were isolated, neutral in all political and moral conflicts, and I think terribly naive. It soon appeared in Asia, then in Europe, and then unmistakably in the attack on Pearl Harbor, that the United States could not stay out of international conflicts. Well, my view of the conflict that has been taking place since that time, and which took me down to Washington to win the war after Pearl Harbor and somehow in a prolonged fit of absent-mindedness, I never quite got away all these years. What was really going on was a conflict between two social and political systems. Originally, it was the American pluralistic, democratic, individualistic social system of an open society with constitutional guarantees of liberties, with rights of minorities, things that I don't need to explain to you, especially here at this Ashbrook Center, which is trying to make sure everybody understands those values of our society. But there was a conflict initially with with Hitler's Germany primarily, although the Italians had a corporate state on a similar model, and the Japanese military dictatorship was in some ways comparable. We were opposing, actually, our system of pluralist or democratic society was being attacked by totalitarian governments. Now, there isn't a very good word for this kind of society different from ours, and I used totalitarian. It sounds abstract and makes you puzzle a little bit about what it means, but it's really very simple. It means that the government of the state is a dictatorship. That is, it does not justify its control of the country on any legal or moral grounds, but simply that on the grounds that they are in charge and have the right totally to control the lives of everybody so as to make the nation strong and triumphant. Hitler's Germany is the example in which a weak nation allowed a lot of very decent people to be trapped into the hands of a megalomaniac dictator, Adolf Hitler, who finally ruined that country, and fortunately, as a result of World War II, saw a regeneration of a democratic and pluralistic society there, which is now belongs to the kind of society that we're trying to preserve. But beginning with that military effort, which we were belatedly pushed into, and very nearly too late, we have been opposing totalitarian systems because they tend to be not only bad for their own people and bad as neighbors, but to be, as many scholars have observed, always inclined, because of a kind of paranoid quality of a dictatorship, which can't trust its own people, let alone outsiders, to expand its influence abroad in order to make more and more territory safe for its own kind of control and its own kind of society. And we discovered at the end of World War II, when I was still in the Office of Strategic Services, studying Germany and Japan and China in the future, our ally, the Soviet Union, which was a perfect model of the same kind of state that Hitler had created in Germany, one-party dictatorship with no civil liberties, no rights of individual expression, total control of the populace, and no free economic decisions, state-managed economic life. The Soviet Union began as soon as the war had ended in moving ahead to consolidate its power in all of Eastern Europe. Some of the states that we really got into the war with the United Kingdom of Great Britain to try to restore to freedom, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Soviet Union subjected those countries to a series of actions which ended up giving each of them a mirror image Soviet-type state in the hands of small minorities. In some states it was a little hard to tell exactly how that happened, but in most cases it was very obvious that Soviet military occupation simply managed to kill or imprison the people who wanted to have, as the majority did, a free and independent society, and to put into power people who had been trained in Moscow in the 20s and 30s and were simply imposed on those populations. We know that's true because we saw three successive revolts, really four if you count recent Polish resistance to Soviet control, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, East Germany back in 1953, and more recently Poland, all restive and trying to get just a modicum of political freedom under the Soviet military occupation, which is there, and political control, which is very omnipresent and is dangerous to anybody who tries to have a free life. Well, this struggle against totalitarianism is not over. The struggle which in 1945 most of us thought we had won and settled once and for all turned out to be only the beginning of a 50-year struggle which Jack Kennedy called the twilight struggle, the long years of twilight conflict. Not the glare of bombs bursting in midair, but the struggle to establish individual human freedoms to prevent any nation from expunging the open societies, the freedom in open societies, and occupying them. And we haven't done too well in this struggle. We have had some victories, but we've had some very serious defeats as the establishment of a model Soviet base with Soviet military presence and weapons in the state of Cuba in this hemisphere demonstrates. Fidel Castro was and always was, contrary to many hopes, a communist who wanted to make his way to dominance in Central America with Soviet money and military equipment. He would have made much more progress than he has had it not been for that Cuba Missile Crisis of 1962, which the young lady mentioned, and which I was very much involved in, when Jack Kennedy made the Soviet Union pull its nuclear weapons out of Cuba. But mind you, everything else in the way of military weapons and in the way of short-of-war conflict is still based in Cuba, has leapfrogged to Nicaragua, and is searching for nooks and crannies, crevices to creep into to establish a communist-type Cuban Soviet-dominated state throughout Central and South America. Now, we have resisted those kind of pressures, often successfully, but we have a very hard time fighting back. And I want to say that our intelligence system has had its ups and downs in persuading the decision makers about the real nature of this problem. Let me go back historically, because I promised to give you a historical perspective, and say that our system of government has always tolerated and in fact depended upon an intelligence system. The modern intelligence system, operating in a period of not war, not peace, conflict, not of a strictly military sort, is recent. It is post-World War II, and our modern intelligence system really started when President Roosevelt set up Bill Donovan, General Donovan, as the head of the Office of Strategic Services, and said, in effect, we need to know about what is going on in the world. We need to try to influence events, because then it was wartime and no one doubted that we should operate behind the lines of Japanese and German and Italian military borders if we could, to encourage resistance to those dictatorships. But we also needed to understand the evolution of events in all of the countries in the world, because in the absence of a vast nuclear conflict or a vast conventional war like World War II, both of which are so damaging and destructive in prospect today, that the Soviet Union is not intending to win influence by those means, but simply to use its military power to intimidate people to surrender political concessions piecemeal, country by country, so that it will indeed be much more powerful and influential than the United States, and in the process discredit the courage, the morale, the capability of defending itself of what the Soviet Union considers a totally unacceptable form of society, the democratic society. Now, as I say, we've had our ups and downs in these matters, and to be a little historical, Harry Truman, at the end of World War II, after he had abolished OSS just like that at the end of the war, on the grounds that if you didn't have a declared state of war, you didn't need any information, presumably, and then been obliged by pressures of international events to create CIA in 1947, Harry Truman created a doctrine of helping people who wanted to be able to defend themselves from what he called internal or external aggression. And if the object of the aggression was to create another communist state to aggrandize the power of the Soviet Union, Truman undertook to try to resist that process. Well, this in the 40s wasn't so hard, because the blackmail effort of the Soviet Union was not too great, because we had atomic weapons and they didn't. They had a huge mass conventional army which scared the hell out of Western Europe, but was never unleashed because of the atomic weapons. But over these years, to foreshorten the complicated strategic story, the Soviet Union has successively squeezed out of its own people and out of its own more meager economy the wherewithal to build a nuclear force equal to ours, to keep a conventional army much larger than ours, and to move outside its own borders in small steps, which we are reluctant to resist out of fear that somehow we may provoke a direct military conflict with those huge forces. I think we're too much afraid of that danger, because the Soviet Union makes it very clear in its own internal doctrinal literature that it intends to use military power as an umbrella under which to conduct what they call wars of national liberation, which means any war that is to the disinterest of the United States and in the interest of the Soviet Union, to conduct political coups, guerrilla attacks, destabilization efforts, economic and political, and terrorist incursions in open societies. That is the kind of war we're confronting today, and I think that's what our intelligence system has discovered. Unfortunately, the intelligence system has to tell the government. If it tells everything it knows, and particularly how it finds out what's happening, of course, they blow their sources, and that's against the law as well as against common sense. So I've spent my life, and many of my colleagues have, briefing presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of defense and that vast array of sub-cabinet and secondary and tertiary staff officers on the facts of life about the policies, the behavior patterns, and the intentions of the Soviet Union and its string of states in Eastern Europe that are completely captive as far as the governments and the intelligence agencies are concerned. North Korea, now Vietnam, Cuba, Angola in Africa, what their system is intended to do to damage our interests abroad. May I say the low point in all of this was in the late 1970s, and I don't have time to give you my explanation of how we got there, but you will mostly remember that we did louse up the Vietnam War, which I believe we could have won in the sense of saving a non-communist South Vietnam had we applied ourselves correctly and understood the kind of war we were fighting. But also we went through this humiliating Watergate experience and the near impeachment of a president and sort of a loss of public confidence and morale, even in our own system of government. And after that, 1975, the communist states, that was then still Communist China, North Vietnam, the Soviet Union, moved into Southeast Asia, dominating Vietnam, South Vietnam, killing millions of people in Cambodia and Vietnam, moving into Africa. Angola was set up as a state which the Soviet Union would subsidize so it could undermine neighboring states, particularly Namibia and South Africa. And of course the bloody Middle East, which was an actual military conflict zone, has been for many years, repeated wars in which some of the states in the area try to destroy the state of Israel, which has been the modern state and democratically oriented state, trying to cooperate with the United States in the Mideast, which is so important to us because of its oil, our energy source, as Africa is important to us for its rare mineral resources. Well, in this period after Watergate, after Vietnam, I think, to oversimplify it, the American public just sort of got fed up with the international harassment, and they watched in dismay, but with no idea what to do about it, the Soviet moves into Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Angola, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and forward movement from Cuba into Nicaragua. This 5 years, from 1975 to 1980, was certainly the most humiliating experience for Americans in my lifetime. And Jimmy Carter, as you remember, who came to office because he was innocent and unlike Richard Nixon, turned out to be extremely innocent about communist activity abroad. He told us in 1980, after the invasion of Afghanistan, that he'd learned more in 2 weeks about the Soviet Union by observing what they were doing around the world than he'd learned all the rest of his life. Well, that's the most humiliating statement an American president could make, in my opinion. The idea that you could come to be the president without understanding anything about communist policy and Soviet policy is almost beyond belief. But at any rate, we have turned around since then because our intelligence agencies have been doing research and analysis, collecting data, and explaining what was happening. And I don't think many people in the United States any longer feel that we can escape these international conflicts, nor that we can deal with them sensibly without an active intelligence service working abroad, finding out what's happening in Ethiopia and in Afghanistan, supporting our political processes in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, which are struggling to build democratic systems. But there is a reservation, and I'm sure that if you ask me questions, you'll be thinking about this field. There is a great reservation in this country about a fourth area of intelligence activity. That is covert political action. I've spoken about collection, counter-espionage, research and analysis, contribution to decision-making. Now, the CIA, because it is a secret agency, is the only instrument of this open society that can do secret things abroad. And for that reason, not because of any policy of its own, not for any lust for adventure, which I assure you doesn't exist among these very practical and businesslike professionals, but because the President of the United States and his cabinet in the national security field decide certain influences abroad would be helpful to stabilizing areas under attack by wars of national liberation or terrorism, and would buttress influence of the United States abroad and increase our own national security, the President has ordered CIA in a surprisingly small number of cases to try to strengthen governments that are under attack or strengthen groups like the Afghans or the Nicaragua Contra armies to fight against governments that are consolidating a communist totalitarian model government in their own country. If there is a strong resistance among the population to the consolidation of that kind of government, it has been most of the time the policy of the United States government, and it certainly was under Truman, Eisenhower, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan. Kind of skips there for a while. It was the policy to assist, in accordance with the Truman Doctrine, people who are willing to fight themselves to preserve free institutions from external or internal use of force to impose a dictatorship on them. And President Reagan, in my view, to his credit, has tried to establish again the principle that the United States will be of practical assistance in preserving the balance between free and totalitarian societies by helping people who will help themselves. Now, the CIA is the instrument of trying to give that assistance with the kind of secrecy that will enable it to be effective. Obviously, if we want to declare war with all the psychological and political disadvantages that would cause, we can. I don't see that any wars are going to be declared in this twilight struggles period. Instead, we try, without attribution to the United States government, but awfully openly because of our open society, to extend training and money and arms to people who are fighting for the kind of free institutions that we believe in. And that is the fourth function that CIA gets saddled with. As I say, it doesn't happen in many countries, it doesn't happen very often, but when the president gives a secret order to the CIA to intervene in these situations, it does so, and it tries to assist in practical ways to create situations which will be to our benefit as well as to the people concerned. Now, this is a controversial policy. People often disagree with the use of force, even for a good purpose. I think that the presidents who have opted for that are right. But in any case, I want to ask you to remember that whatever you think about covert political action abroad, that's a policy issue. Debate that with your president, with your congressional representatives, debate it publicly. But remember that if the president, as commander-in-chief, says we are defending our national security in this way, it would be treason for the officials of the Central Intelligence Agency not to carry out that instruction. And don't beat up the messenger boy. That is what's been happening in this country for 10 or 15 years. CIA has been seriously weakened, almost destroyed in the Carter period. It's been rejuvenated under President Reagan, and it is now again being pilloried for intervening in Nicaragua, not so much in Afghanistan, which is so far away, I guess most people think it's okay to intervene there. But it is being criticized and may be destroyed, damaged as it was in the 1970s. Now, the reason I wanted to put all this historical perspective before you is that whatever you think about covert action, even if we cut it out altogether, don't forget, unless we have the professional, academically qualified, experienced people in foreign affairs who can collect that information by technical or human means, espionage, and analyze it objectively and realistic, and provide our government with options as to what it can do. Send in the Marines, conduct a political covert action, or simply negotiate and have a political diplomatic match, which we may win or lose. Those options ought to be very realistic and very accurate. And I think that's what our intelligence system is all about. And that's why we need to have one, and we need to have the citizens of the country understand why it's important, because I can assure you, in the great city of Washington, D.C., the many members of the Congress and most of the members of the news media see CIA and the intelligence system as a nice, sexy target to shoot at, regardless of responsibility or options. And if we do let our guard down, then I think the international conflict, which, as I say, Jack Kennedy called the twilight struggle, will gradually go against us, because we will not be close enough to the facts nor understand the issues well enough to advise our government properly. That's the message I want to leave with you today. Thank you very much.